She was 19, and she had nowhere to sleep, no family to write to, no wages coming, no plan past the end of the week, just a tin thimble in her apron pocket and 2-pound coins knotted into the corner of a handkerchief. And with that £2, Margaret Reed bought the derelict village station at Ashcombe Halt, a timber and slate ruin nobody in the parish would touch, sold off by the closed branch line for the price of a loaf and a pot of tea. But what nobody in Ashcombe knew, and what Margaret herself would not know until she lifted the third flagstone in the waiting room floor, was that beneath those flags lay a sealed chamber holding parish records, silver plate, and legal papers hidden away for the best part of 40 years. Papers that would overturn an inheritance the whole town had accepted as settled and shake Ashcombe to its foundations. Settle in for this one, and before we begin, do tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love to know who is listening in tonight. Margaret Reed was born in the spring of 1852 in a 2-room cottage on the outskirts of a Somerset village called Petherton Bridge, the only surviving child of a stonemason named John Reed and his wife Anne, who took in mending and sometimes laid out the dead for the parish when the older women were too tired. Her father was a quiet man with a chipped thumbnail from a mallet slip he had never let heal properly, and he taught Margaret, without meaning to teach her anything, how to look at a wall and see whether the mortar was sound, how to tell dressed stone from rubble fill, how to knock a slate and hear whether it rang true or answered dull. Her mother, patient and thin, taught her to darn a stocking so the mend would outlast the wool, to boil a shirt collar white with lye and blue, to render mutton fat for candles when there was fat to spare, and to keep the household accounts in a small brown book with a piece of string sewn into the spine. There was a little brother once, called Thomas, who lived 9 months and was buried under a slate marker, "John cut himself," and after that, Anne Reed's cough set in and did not leave. When Margaret was 11, her mother died in the front room on a Tuesday in February, and John Reed carried the coffin to the churchyard on his own shoulder because he would not let the parish do it, and then he sat down at the kitchen table and drank tea for a long time without speaking. After that, it was the two of them, and John Reed sent Margaret up the lane 3 days a week to help at the vicarage, where the housekeeper was a widow of 60 called Mrs. Hester Wainwright, a woman with iron-gray hair pinned very tight, and hands so capable they seemed to know the answer to a task before the task had finished being set. Mrs. Wainwright had lost her own daughter years before to a fever, and though she never spoke of it, she took Margaret in the way a good gardener takes a cutting, carefully, with attention, and with the expectation that it would grow. She taught Margaret to bake a loaf that would keep 4 days, to raise a pie crust with hot water and lard, to press linen with a flat iron heated on the hob without scorching, to keep the vicar's household books in double column, to compound a poultice of comfrey and mustard for a sprained wrist, and to hold her tongue when gentlemen were speaking foolishness in the next room. She taught Margaret, most of all, to look a room over on entering and see at once what needed doing, and to do it without being asked. In the 4 years Margaret worked at the vicarage, she was paid 2 shillings a week and her tea, and Mrs. Wainwright gave her, on her 15th birthday, a small brass thimble of the older sort, worn smooth on the crown by another woman's finger, over 40 years of stitching, and she said, plainly, that a girl who could sew could feed herself in any parish in England. When Margaret was 16, John Reed fell from a scaffold on the north tower of a church he was rebuilding at Long Ashton, and though he lived 3 days, he did not wake, and the parish buried him, beside Anne and Thomas, in a plot Margaret paid for, with the last of his tools, sold to a mason from Bristol. The cottage was rented, and the rent fell due, and there was a matter of a small debt to a timber merchant, Her father had meant to settle at Michaelmas. A cousin of her father's, a man called Wilfred Reed, who kept a chandler's shop in Taunton, came in a hired trap and looked over the cottage, and the tools, and the little brown accounts book, and he told Margaret in the front room, standing with his hat in his hand, that he could not take a girl of 16 into a house where his wife's temper was already tried, and that she must find a place, and that he would settle the timber merchant so the family name should not be spoken of. He was not unkind. He gave her 3 shillings and a cold meat pie wrapped in a cloth, and he took the tools and the brown book with him when he left, and Margaret watched the trap go down the lane, and understood that she was alone in the world, in a way she had not been alone the week before. She kept the brass thimble. She kept a folded square of her mother's blue Sunday shawl, wool so fine it could be drawn through a wedding ring, and a small carved wooden bird her father had whittled for Thomas, the winter before Thomas died. A wren, no bigger than a walnut, with the eye marked in pencil, and never painted in. These 3 things she wrapped in a scrap of oiled linen and tied with string, and she carried them in the deep pocket, sewn inside her second-best skirt, and she did not put them down for the next 3 years, even when she had almost nothing else. She went to Mrs. Wainwright at the vicarage, who took her in for a season without wages, and then to a farm at Chewton, where she milked and mended for her keep, and then to a draper's back shop in Wells, where she stitched shirt collars by lamplight until her eyes ached, and then, at 18, to a lodging house in a small market town called Ashcombe, where she had heard through a carrier that a seamstress was wanted at a linen shop on the square. The seamstress place fell through. A niece had been given it the week before, and Margaret found herself in a strange town with £2 and 4 shillings in a handkerchief, a bed paid for 1 more night, and no next place to go. The lodging house at Ashcombe stood at the narrow end of a lane behind the Corn Exchange, and it was kept by a Mrs. Bickle, a widow of about 55, who wore a black stuff dress and a cameo brooch, and who spoke to her lodgers only when money was owed or a rule had been broken. Margaret had taken the small back room on the 2nd floor, a room with a sloped ceiling and a single window looking out over slate roofs and a piece of the churchyard wall, and she had paid 1 shilling a night for 6 nights, and been civil and clean and quiet, and Mrs. Bickle had at first been civil and clean and quiet in return. On the 7th morning, when Margaret came down to the passage to leave for the linen shop on the square, where the seamstress place, though gone, had left a slim hope that other work might be found near it, she saw that Mrs. Bickle had pinned a folded slip of paper to the door of the back parlor with her name on it, Miss Reed, in a neat sloping hand. Margaret unpinned it and read it standing in the cold hall. The note said, in 6 lines, that the room was let from Friday to a commercial gentleman from Bridgewater who had written ahead that Mrs. Bickle regretted the necessity and wished Miss Reed every success, that the bed linen was to be stripped by 10 o'clock, that the wash jug was to be emptied, and that any further nights could not be offered as the house was full. There was no signature and no unkindness in the words. The unkindness was the paper itself, and the pin, and the small, careful hand that had not troubled to knock. Margaret folded the note in half and put it in her apron pocket beside the thimble, and she went upstairs and stripped the bed as she had been asked. She folded the sheet and the blanket and the coverlet in 3 neat piles at the foot of the ticking mattress. She emptied the wash jug into the slop bucket and rinsed it and set it upside down on the washstand. She swept the small hearth with a hand broom she found behind the coal scuttle, and she brushed out the ashes into the grate so that the next lodger would find the room as she had found it. Then she opened the oiled linen bundle in her pocket to be sure of it, and she counted the coins in the knotted handkerchief. 2 sovereigns, 4 shillings, a 3-penny piece, and a bent halfpenny, and she tied them up again and put them into the deep skirt pocket beside the bundle. She put on her bonnet and her shawl, She carried her small canvas bag, with her second shift, and her comb, and her Sunday stockings, and a piece of soap wrapped in newspaper. And she went down the stairs, and out through the back door of the lodging house, without seeing Mrs. Bickle, who was busy in the front kitchen with a delivery of coal. In the yard she stopped and settled the shawl across her shoulders, and pulled the strings of her bonnet tight, and she took a slow breath of the cold air, and looked at the sky over the roofs to judge the weather, as her mother had taught her, and as Mrs. Wainwright had taught her again, and she saw that the low cloud was thinning towards the west, and that there would be light rain by noon, and dry ground by evening. She did not stand in the yard for long. She had learned in 3 years that standing still in a strange place drew attention and drew questions, and that neither attention nor questions helped a girl alone, and that the thing to do when a door closed behind her was to walk while she could still think, and to keep her hands busy with the straps of her bag so that they did not tremble, and to keep her face composed as if she were on an errand for a mistress, rather than on no errand at all. She went out of the lane, and across the corn exchange yard, and down the square, past the linen shop, where the niece was already at the window, rolling a bolt of grey calico, and she did not look in. She walked out of Ashcombe by the road that ran west, because the west was where the low cloud was thinning, and because the carrier who had first spoken to her of the town had come in from that direction, and she thought that if she could reach the next village by evening, she might find a barn or a laundry or a farm kitchen where she could offer a night's work for a night's shelter and be believed. The road out of Ashcombe rose steadily between hedgerows of blackthorn and hazel, hung still with the last brown leaves of November, and the ditches on either side were wet from the previous week's rain, and smelled of moss and cold iron and rotting oak. She walked with her bag balanced on her right hip, and her left hand pushed deep into her skirt pocket where the bundle was, and she counted her steps in hundreds, as she had counted stitches in the draper's back shop, and after every 1,000 steps she stopped and set the bag on the top of a gate or a stone, and rested her arm, and looked at the country. It was a broad country of small fields, divided by dry stone walls and pollarded willows, of ash and oak in the hollows, of church towers rising 3 and 4 miles apart across the low ridges, and the road she was on dipped and rose and dipped again through the folds of it. She passed a shepherd moving a small flock along a lane, and touched her bonnet to him, and he touched his cap to her without speaking. She passed a woman gathering nettles into a sack for a pig, and gave her good day, and the woman answered, and asked her where she was walking, and Margaret said only, "To the next village," and the woman nodded and let her go without further asking, which was a kindness. The light rain came at noon, as she had known it would, and she pulled the shawl up over her bonnet and walked on through it, and the road ran black and shining under her boots, and the hedges dripped, and after an hour the rain thinned again to a fine mist, and then to nothing. And by 2 o'clock she came down a long slope towards a scatter of grey slate roofs in a hollow, and a small square church tower, and a line of alders marking a brook, and beyond the roofs a low timber building with a slate roof and a broken paling fence, and a rusted iron sign on a post at the roadside that read, in painted letters half-eaten by weather, Ashcombe Halt. She stood at the roadside for a while, and looked at it, because she had learned to look at a place before she went into it, and she saw that the building was longer than she had first thought. A single-story structure of pitch pine boards set on a low course of local stone, with a slate roof in 2 pitches and a short covered platform running along the side that had faced the line. The line itself was gone. The rails had been lifted years before and sold for the iron, and where they had run there was now a long, shallow trench full of nettles and rosebay willow herb gone brown, and beyond it the embankment sloped down to a hedge. She counted the windows on the roadside, and made it 4. 2 of them still glazed with leaded panes, and 2 boarded up with rough deal, nailed across the frames. And she saw that the door in the middle, which had been the passenger's entrance, hung a little crooked on its lower hinge, but was shut. She went in through the broken paling gate and crossed a yard of cinders grown over with grass and thistle. At the door, she set down her bag and tried the iron ring latch and found it stiff, but not locked. She pushed the door in with her shoulder, and it opened onto a passage that smelt of cold soot, damp plaster, and mice. The passage ran the length of the building. To the right was the waiting room, 12 feet by 16 by her stonemason father's inherited measure, with a floor of gray flagstones laid in irregular sizes, a cast-iron stove in the middle, set on a hearth of firebrick, a pine bench built into the far wall under the platform window, and a plaster ceiling, stained brown in 3 places by roof leaks. The plaster was sound where it was not stained. The bench was salvageable. The stove was rusted on the top plate, but its door still swung, and its flue rose true through the roof. To the left was the ticket office, 6 feet by 8, with a small hatch of pitch pine cut through into the waiting room, and a shelf under the hatch, on which the tickets had once been counted. Behind the ticket office was a smaller room that had been the station master's, with a narrow fireplace of cast iron and a cracked marble hearth, 1 shelf of books left behind, and swollen with damp beyond reading, and a truckle bedstead of iron with no mattress. At the back of the passage was a lean-to scullery, with a stone sink, a copper set in brick for boiling water, and a door out to a walled patch of garden gone to bramble. Margaret walked the length of it slowly, and put her hand on each wall in turn, as her father had taught her. She judged that the timbers were sound, because the ground was well drained, and the slate had held over most of the roof, and that 3 slates only were slipped on the road pitch and could be reset from inside, without a ladder against the eaves. She judged that the 2 boarded windows would want new glass, but that the frames themselves were true. She judged that the stove would draw once the flue was swept, and that the copper in the scullery, though its brickwork was cracked on one side, would boil water for washing, and for a bath in a tin tub if she could find one. She sat down on the pine bench under the platform window, and opened the oiled linen bundle in her lap, and set the 3 items on the bench beside her. The brass thimble worn smooth on its crown, the folded square of blue Sunday shawl, and the small carved wren, no bigger than a walnut with its penciled eye. She looked at them for a long moment, and then she wrapped them again, and put them back in her pocket, and she said aloud, in the quiet of the room, that she would begin with the flagstones, because they were dirty, and because a clean floor was where her mother had always begun. She had bought the place that same morning, in fact, for £2 paid in a solicitor's front room in Ashcombe, from a Mr. Hollis, who acted for what remained of the branch line company, and who had blinked at her twice across his desk before writing out the receipt without comment. The line had been closed 9 years. The land the station stood on had been offered at auction, and had not sold, and had been offered again, by private treaty, at a nominal figure, to be rid of the tax on it. And Margaret had heard of it from the carrier's boy in Ashcombe Yard, while she waited for the west road to dry, and she had turned back into the town and walked into the solicitor's office and laid the 2 sovereigns on the desk and asked what she must sign. Mr. Hollis had given her the receipt, the key, and the address, and had wished her, in a dry voice, good afternoon. She began that afternoon with the flagstones, and it was in the course of cleaning them that she found what was beneath the 3rd one. She had swept the waiting room floor first with a broom of birch twigs bound with wire that she had made herself in the yard, having noticed a birch by the paling gate, and having remembered how Mrs. Hester Wainwright had bound the vicarage brooms in autumn. She had swept out the accumulated leaves and mouse droppings, and the cindery dust that had blown in under the door for years, and she had carried it all out in a rusted coal scuttle to the compost patch behind the scullery. Then she had gone down on her knees with a bucket of water drawn from the brook in a tin pail and a rag torn from her old shift, and she had begun to wash the stones one by one, starting at the far corner under the platform window and working toward the door. She found the sound on the third stone in the third row. It was not a sound she was looking for, but her father's teaching came up in her, without her thinking about it, because a stone laid on solid ground has a different note under a knuckle from a stone laid over a void. She had rapped, without meaning to, on the corner of the third stone as she lifted the rag away, and the note that came back was hollow and slightly higher than the note of the two stones on either side of it. She sat back on her heels and rapped again with the flat of her knuckle, and then again in 3 places along the stone, and each time the note was the same, and each time it was wrong. She stood up and fetched from the scullery an old iron poker that had been leaning by the copper, and she wedged its point into the mortar joint at one corner of the stone and worked it patiently along the seam. The mortar was old and dry and came away in gray crumbs. It took her the better part of an hour, because she was careful not to chip the edge of the flag, and because she stopped twice to rest her hands. But at length, the joint was clear on all 4 sides, and she could see that the stone had been set, not in fresh mortar, but in a bed of fine sand, which was how a stone was set when it was meant to be lifted again. She fetched a length of board from the boarded window in the ticket office, prized it free with the poker, and used it as a lever, and she raised the flagstone by inches until she could get her fingers under it, and then she lifted it away and set it on its edge against the bench. Beneath it was a chamber. It was not deep, perhaps 18 inches, and it was lined on its 4 sides with dressed stone laid in lime mortar, the work of a mason who had known his craft, and its floor was of slate laid flat. Inside the chamber were 3 things. The first was a small tin box, the sort in which a clerk kept nibs and sealing wax, painted black and lettered in gilt long faded, and when she lifted the lid she found within it a canvas purse tied with a leather thong, and within the purse, when she loosened it, 22 gold sovereigns wrapped each in a scrap of tissue and a small paper of banknotes to the value of 40 pounds, folded and dry. The second was a bundle of papers tied with red tape. She lifted them out with both hands because they were heavier than they looked, and she saw at once by the seals and the copperplate hands that they were legal papers of consequence, and beneath the red tape a smaller bundle of parish registers in the brown boards of the vestry, and beneath those again a piece of dark cloth wrapping the flat, unmistakable weight of silver plate, 2 chalices, and a small paten, and a set of 6 apostle spoons, marked, as she saw when she turned one, with the arms of the parish of Ashcombe, and the date 1793. The third thing was a letter, folded once and sealed with a wafer of red wax that had cracked, but not broken, and on the outside of the letter, in a careful sloping hand, not unlike her mother's, was written the direction: "To whoever finds this, being of an honest mind, and needing what is here." Margaret sat back on the flagstones with the letter in her lap, and she did not open it at once. She looked instead at the small chamber, and at the 3 things she had lifted out of it, and she understood, in the slow way in which one understands a thing that changes a life, that whoever had set the stone back into its bed of sand 40 years before had done so in the hope that a hand like hers would one day lift it again, and that the hand had come. She opened the letter that evening by the light of a tallow candle she had bought for a penny at the shop in Ashcombe on her walk back from Mr. Hollis's office, set in a saucer on the pine bench, and she read it twice, once through, without stopping, and once slowly, and then she folded it again and put it inside the oiled linen bundle, with the thimble and the shawl and the wren, because it belonged with them now. The letter was signed by one Josiah Penrose, formerly clerk to the parish vestry of Ashcombe, from 1810 to 1832, and after that station master at Ashcombe Halt, from the opening of the branch line in 1836 until his death, which he had felt approaching when he wrote, in the autumn of 1838. He had put the parish plate and the parish registers and the papers into the chamber, he wrote, because the vestry had been broken into twice in the year of 1838, and because he did not trust the churchwarden of that time, a man named Barrow, into whose hand the plate and the registers had been given for safekeeping, and who had, Josiah Penrose believed, altered a page of the burial register to erase a marriage that would have thrown the succession of the manor farm at Ashcombe into the wrong hands. He had taken the plate quietly out of the vestry after evensong on a Thursday, and had substituted a note to himself that he had removed it for cleaning, and he had never returned it. He had put the sovereigns and the banknotes, which were his own savings, into the chamber as well, because he had no children and no wife left living, and he wished that the plate should not be found alone by any man who might sell it, and that the finder should have enough in the same place to make honesty easier than dishonesty. He hoped, he wrote in the last line, that the hand which lifted the stone would be a hand that had known hard work and would use what was there for a plain purpose. The next morning, Margaret walked back into Ashcombe with the letter and the bundle of legal papers and the parish registers wrapped in her shawl and carried inside her canvas bag, and she went first to the vicarage of Ashcombe and asked to see the vicar, who was a man of about 50, named the Reverend Amos Chettle, thin, spectacled, and slow of speech, who received her in his study without ceremony, because she asked him plainly, and because she was carrying, as she said at the door, parish property. She laid the registers and the papers on his desk, and gave him the letter to read. He read it twice, as she had, and then he took off his spectacles and cleaned them on a square of linen, and put them on again, and he said quietly that Josiah Penrose had been remembered in the parish as a careful man, and that the churchwarden Barrow had died in prosperous circumstances 40 years before, and that the manor farm at Ashcombe was now held by his grandson, and that the matter would have to be laid before the bishop's registrar and before Mr. Hollis, who was solicitor to more than one estate in the district, and that she had done rightly to come to him at once. She left the plate at the station under the flagstone, replaced for the moment in its bed of sand, and told him only that it was safe, because she wished to see first what kind of man he was, before she brought it out. He accepted this without asking further. Over the following weeks the papers were examined by the registrar at Wells and by Mr. Hollis, who read them at his desk with the same dry blink with which he had watched her lay down her 2 sovereigns, and who told her at the end of a long afternoon that Josiah Penrose had been careful in more ways than one, that the burial register in his hand showed the entry which the vestry copy did not, and that a marriage of 1802 between one Mary Ashcombe and one Nathaniel Ford, of which a child had been born and christened at Ashcombe in the same year, had been erased from the vestry copy, in a hand which the registrar was prepared to swear was not Josiah Penrose's. The line of descent from that child, said Mr. Hollis, ran through a family named Ford, still living, 3 of them, at a small farm called Higher Combe, 6 miles west, and they were the rightful heirs to the manor farm at Ashcombe, which had been enjoyed under a different reading of the register by the Barrow family for 2 generations. Margaret said only that she had brought the papers because they had been left for someone to bring them, and she signed her name as finder in a book Mr. Hollis kept for such things, Margaret Ann Reed, in the neat sloping hand she had learned at the vicarage in Petherton Bridge, and she walked back to Ashcombe Halt through a light frost. She began that same afternoon on the slates. She had counted 3 slipped on the road pitch, and she reset them from inside the roof, standing on the iron truckle bedstead which she had dragged into the waiting room for the purpose, with a length of copper wire twisted through the head of each slate to hold it on the batten, because she had no fresh nails. She swept the flue of the stove with a bundle of holly branches tied to a long ash pole, cut from the hedge and drawn up and down until the soot came down into the grate in soft black falls. She lit the stove that evening, with kindling of dry gorse and a shovel of coal she had bought for 3 pence from a carter passing along the road, and the flue drew clean, and the waiting room warmed by the length of a candle. She spent the sovereigns carefully and slowly, the way her mother's brown accounts book would have counted them. She bought, in the first week, 6 panes of leaded glass and a small tin of putty from a glazier named Mr. Alfred Standish, aged 42, of Ashcombe, who came out on his cart on a Wednesday and glazed the 2 boarded windows for her while she held the pieces steady, and who accepted his money and a cup of tea from the boiled copper, and told her, before he drove away, that the station had been a shame to the parish for 9 years, and was a shame no longer. She bought a stone of flour and a pound of lard and a paper of yeast and a twist of salt from the shop in Ashcombe, and she baked, on the Thursday morning, in the top of the cast-iron stove, a loaf of the kind Mrs. Hester Wainwright had taught her to bake, that would keep 4 days. She bought a straw mattress from a woman in the village named Mrs. Nellie Trewin, aged 60, a widow with a son at sea, who brought it up on a hand-cart with her neighbor, and who accepted 3 shillings for it and would take no more, and who, when she saw that Margaret was sleeping alone in the station-master's room, on the iron truckle bedstead, with the mattress laid across it, brought back that same evening a pair of woolen blankets she said she had no use for, and would not take back. Others came, one by one, as the news of the papers and the plate spread through Ashcombe. Mr. Ford of Higher Combe, aged 58, a small, quiet farmer with earth on his boots, came down the road on a Saturday with his eldest son, and set down at Margaret's door a sack of seed potatoes, a sack of onions, and a dressed side of bacon, and he took off his cap on the platform and said that the Fords owed her what could not be paid in bacon, and Margaret said that they owed her nothing, and that she was glad the papers were where they should be, and he set the cap back on his head and went away without saying more. A carpenter named Mr. Josiah Nance, aged 36, married with 2 children, came on a Monday with his box of tools, and rehung the crooked door on its lower hinge, and planed the sill of the passenger entrance, where it had swelled and refused the door, and he cut and fitted a new pine shelf for the ticket office hatch, and he would take, at the end of the day, only a loaf of Margaret's 4-day bread and a pot of tea. The vicar, the Reverend Amos Chettle, came on a Tuesday, with a small bundle of second-hand books from the vicarage shelves, dry ones, that he said had been meant for the parish reading room that had never been built, and he set them on the pine bench without ceremony. Mrs. Hester Wainwright wrote from Petherton Bridge, having heard from the carrier, and sent by return post a small parcel containing a packet of comfrey leaves, a paper of bluing, a length of unbleached calico, and a note in her plain hand, which said only that she had always known Margaret would find her place, and that she was to write when the winter was over. Margaret filed, in the course of that first month, 3 papers with Mr. Hollis, being the receipt for the station under her own hand, an inventory of the plate as she had delivered it up to the vicar and the registrar, and a claim of finder's interest under the old parish custom for the sum of £40 in banknotes and 22 sovereigns, which the registrar, upon consideration and upon the plain wording of Josiah Penrose's letter, allowed to her without contest. She put the money into an account at the savings bank in Ashcombe, under her own name, drew from it only what she needed, and kept in the tin box beside the stove a small brown accounts book bought for a penny at the stationer's on the square, in which she entered every shilling in and every shilling out, in double column, as her mother had kept them, and as Mrs. Hester Wainwright had taught her a second time to keep them. By the middle of December, the waiting room was clean and warm, its flagstones washed, and the third stone in the third row reset in fresh lime mortar over the empty chamber, the plate and papers being now in the vestry at Ashcombe, under a new lock. The two glazed windows let in a clear north light. The stove drew. The pine bench under the platform window held 3 cushions Margaret had stitched from the length of unbleached calico Mrs. Hester Wainwright had sent, stuffed with dry bracken from the embankment, and covered with a piece of the blue Sunday shawl, cut with steady hands, and hemmed with the brass thimble on her finger, the thimble that another woman had worn smooth over 40 years of stitching, worn a little smoother now. She hung a small painted board over the passenger door, with the words, "Tea and Mending," lettered in black, on a white ground by the carpenter, Mr. Nance, who had a good hand for lettering, and she opened the waiting room on a Thursday of that same December, at 10 in the morning, and she made a pot of tea, in a brown earthenware pot, bought for 4pence at the market, and she waited to see who would come. The first was Mrs. Nellie Trewin, who came at 10:30 with a basket of mending and a penny in her hand, and who sat on the pine bench under the window and drank a cup of tea, while Margaret sewed a patch on the elbow of her son's shore-going coat, with stitches so small, the cloth seemed to close itself. Then came a girl of about 12, named Alice Hobbs, sent by her mother from a cottage at the top of the village, with a linen sheet split down the middle, and a request that it be turned sides to middle for 6pence. And Margaret took the sheet, made the tea, and sent the girl away with a piece of the 4-day bread. Then came Mr. Standish the glazier, with no work for her but a stone jar of pickled onions his wife had made, and he sat and drank a cup of tea, and told her the market prices for glass in Bristol, and how they had risen. Within a fortnight, the waiting room at Ashcombe Halt had become, without any declaration of the fact by anyone, the mending room of the parish. Women came in on their way to and from the shops in Ashcombe, sat on the bench, drank a cup of tea for a penny, and left their torn aprons, worn sheets, ripped shirts, and unraveling stockings in a basket by the stove. Margaret worked through the basket in the afternoons, and returned the mended things in a second basket on Thursdays and Saturdays. She kept the accounts in the brown book, a penny for tea, 3pence for a small mend, 6pence for a large one, a shilling for turning a sheet, and half a crown for cutting down a grown woman's dress to fit a girl. The vicar came in once a week for a cup of tea and a piece of bread, and he brought her, in January, 3 orphaned parish account books that had been lying damp in the vestry, and he asked her whether she would keep them for him in double column, and she agreed, and he paid her 1 shilling and 6pence a week for the work, entered as the vicar's clerkship in her brown book. Mr. Hollis the solicitor sent her, in February, 3 small estates' worth of household inventories to fair copy, and paid her by the sheet. Mr. Ford of Higher Combe sent his eldest daughter, aged 14, whose name was Rose, to be taught plain sewing on Tuesday afternoons, and paid in eggs, butter, and, in the spring, a young laying hen. By the end of the first winter, people in Ashcombe knew her name. She was Miss Reed at the station. Small rituals formed. The carrier stopped at the platform gate on his way west on a Monday morning to leave the Bristol newspapers, folded flat, and to take away her letters. The Reverend Amos Chettle held a short service in the waiting room on the Sunday afternoon before Christmas, because the vestry chimney was smoking, and he stood before the pine bench and read the lesson, while 16 villagers sat on chairs Margaret had borrowed from Mrs. Trewin's kitchen, and afterwards they drank tea and ate cake made with an egg from Rose Ford's hen. The station, which had been a shame to the parish for 9 years, and had been offered by private treaty, at a nominal figure, to avoid the tax on it, was, by the end of that spring, a warm, dry timber and slate building, with clean flagstones, drawing chimneys, glazed windows, a mended door, a walled garden freshly turned, 4 rows of potatoes, and a bed of onions set in it by Mr. Ford and his son on a Saturday in March, a laying hen in a small pen at the scullery end, and a lettered board above the door, reading Tea and Mending. It was not grand. It was warm, functional, respected, and filled with purpose, and the woman who kept it was known by name, and greeted by name, and paid by name, and her name was Margaret Reed. On a Thursday evening in May, with the stove drawn low and the door open to the platform, Margaret sat on the pine bench under the window, with the brown accounts book closed on her lap, and the day's basket of mending finished by her feet. The light came in level across the flagstones, and touched the 3rd stone in the 3rd row, where the fresh lime mortar had set pale against the older gray. She took the oiled linen bundle from her skirt pocket, untied the string, and laid the 3 things out on the bench beside her. The brass thimble worn smooth by Mrs. Hester Wainwright's finger over 40 years of stitching, the folded square of her mother's blue Sunday shawl, and the small carved wren, no bigger than a walnut, with the penciled eye that her father had cut for Thomas. Beside them she laid the folded letter of Josiah Penrose, clerk to the vestry from 1810 to 1832, and station master until his death, who had set a stone back in its bed of sand nearly 40 years before, in the hope that a hand like hers would one day lift it. She looked at the 2 things longest, the thimble and the letter, 2 objects from 2 people she had never met in the same room, both of whom had lost a child and had loved another child they never saw grow, and both of whom had chosen, in their quiet way, to leave her something. She thought of Wilfred Reed, who had taken the tools and the small brown accounts book and given her 3 shillings and a cold meat pie, and of Mrs. Bickle, who had pinned a folded note to the back parlor door. She thought of the niece at the linen shop, rolling gray calico in the window. She did not think of them long. She wrapped the thimble, the shawl, and the wren again in the oiled linen, put the letter with them, and tied the string. Margaret Reed had been 19 and homeless, with a tin thimble in her apron pocket, and 2-pound coins knotted into the corner of a handkerchief, and she had spent those 2 pounds on a derelict station that no one else would touch. It was the best 2 pounds she ever spent. If this story has warmed you the way that stove warmed the waiting room at Ashcombe Halt, take a moment to subscribe and share it with someone who has been told that what they have is not enough. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And, if you will, tell us this. What abandoned thing in your own life, a room, a skill, a name, a promise, might be worth lifting the stone to look beneath? And who taught you to listen for the hollow sound?